Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Ross Parnell-Turner. I'm a marine geophysicist at Scripps Oceanography. I'm also the chair of US InterRidge, which is a group that tries to foster collaboration among scientists across a variety of disciplines working in the deep oceans, from mid-ocean ridges, transform faults, and seamounts. And today is our monthly edition of our webinar series, and I'm delighted to be able to have us with us here, Jill McDermott, who is an associate professor at Lehigh University, and I'll let her tell you what she's going to be describing. But Jill started off with a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Dartmouth, and then took a master's from the University of New Hampshire, and completed the PhD program at the MIT Hui Joint Program. She then did a postdoc in the University of Toronto and joined Lehigh in 2016, where she's now an associate professor. We'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but if you could keep them either to yourselves or put them in the chat, we'll deal with them at the end. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Jill, and thank you for agreeing to speak for us today.
Great, thank you, Ross, and thanks for the invitation from InterRidge. So as Ross mentioned, my name's Jill McDermott, and I work at Lehigh University. I'm an associate professor there, and I'm also director of the Lehigh Oceans Research Center. Today, what I'll be describing are some of the emerging outcomes of a project that I have actually with Ross and others. And our project is funded by the Marine Geology and Geophysics program in the Division of Ocean Sciences at the U.S. National Science Foundation. Our work really centers on building a model to forecast a deep sea eruption. And we forecast that eruption to occur in 2025. And so as many of you might know, the eruption started last week. And that was very exciting because it matched with our predictions. It was directly observed by a second NSF-funded project that was out at sea. And so today, what I'd like to tell you about is what we know about this very dynamic ocean system and what we can learn by its continued study. All of this work happens at the seafloor at a mid-ocean ridge. And you can think of the global mid-ocean ridge as the largest continuous feature on our planet. It spans over 65,000 kilometers of extensive submarine mountain ranges. Those mountain ranges are created through diverging tectonic plates, where we have ascending magma, which generates fresh oceanic crust. And most of these mountains are underwater. They're important to us because they create 70% of the oceanic crust through seafloor spreading, and that's driven by episodic volcanic eruptions, like the one that's ongoing now. Heat from the magma forms hydrothermal vents, and those have flowed continuously since Earth's first oceans formed over 3 billion years ago. These vents released high amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, and metals into the ocean, and that influences ocean chemistry and global cycling. Those compounds also support unique life forms and host ecosystems at the vents that thrive on chemosynthesis, life without sunlight. And they form a critical setting for understanding planetary scale processes through plate tectonics, ocean evolution, and the origins of life. The impacts of mid-ocean ridge eruptions are interesting to think about. So first, volcanic activity can damage fiber optic cables through lava burial, through faulting, or through slope failure. For example, you can see the figure in the top right, which shows underwater cables that are resting on the seafloor. These are mostly for communications, like internet. The cables are colored orange, and you can see that they cross the mid-ocean ridge, which is shown in light blue in many places. In addition, there are places with sediment cover, and in those places, you can have a heat intrusion from magmatism, which can release methane and other hydrocarbons. Methane, of course, is a greenhouse gas, and so it can have consequences for climate. Hydrothermal emissions from mid-ocean ridges also influence ocean chemistry through ocean redox, through nutrient fluxes, and the productivity of microbes that thrive on those chemicals. Eruptions also reset vent ecosystems, often catastrophically, and that's a natural method of triggering cycles of collapse and biological succession of new colonizing organisms, So they can tell us a great deal about ecosystem resilience and recolonization rates. And then the third thing I'll mention, or the final thing I'll mention, is that in certain places, depending on the regional setting, you can have collapses or submarine landslides associated with eruptive events, and that could generate localized tsunamis, although not in this particular case today. So the site where I focus is called the East Pacific Rise, or the EPR for short. The EPR is a fast-spreading mid-ocean ridge, and it's located in the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean between the Siquirres and the Clipperton transform faults, and it's shown right in the center of this image in the yellow dot. The EPR is part of a globe-encircling system of ridges and transform faults where new seafloor is created. And so, as I mentioned, hydrothermal fluids are generated in these places through high-temperature reaction between seawater and the permeable ocean crust through which it's circulating. The generation of those fluids is shown in a schematic on the right of your screen. Those hot fluids can achieve temperatures greater than 400 degrees Celsius. Because they're so hot, they're very chemically reactive. And so they significantly change the composition of the seafloor crust, as well as the global ocean, which is the eventual fate of these fluids. They also provide unique habitats for chemosynthetic ecosystems. And so in order to understand how all of this is coupled together, how subsurface fluid flow patterns and the permeability of the crust relates to the volcanic cycle, is fundamentally important to understand the deep sea. But placing meaningful constraints on those dynamics and the links between the magmatic cycle and the hydrothermal processes at the seafloor is really only possible if we have decadal time series studies of temperature, chemistry, and crustal deformation. And so that leads me to the 9-degree 50-minute north segment of the EPR. I call that 9 North for short, and it's valuable scientifically because it's among the most well-studied ridges in the world. And so it is an excellent location where we can meet this challenge. And so hydrothermal events that are associated with the mid-ocean ridge axis, and that is shown as the shallow region of the map in the center. Those have been visited yearly by the NSF-funded Ridge 2000 program several decades ago, so between 1991 and 2007. Some of the locations of venting have persisted throughout this whole time, and these are shown on the far right. These vents are still active today. I will show you both historical data and some recently collected data in this talk from these vents. Over 30 years of observation, or at least up until last week, there have been 2 documented volcanic eruptions that impacted the seafloor here. There have now been 3, but the last 2 before this one was in 1991 and 1992, and the second eruption in 2005-2006. And in the map on the far right, you can see the outline of that last eruption. The extent of the eruption is shown with a red line. Within that red line, new lava was emplaced throughout the caldera of the volcano. We call that the axial summit trough. And it was most abundant surrounding the central vents, which are called Bio9 vent and P vent. And they're in the pink and red symbols. There was also abundant lava emplaced in the northern part of the map, surrounding M vent and Q vent in the blue and the purple. And then the lava flow extended south to V vent in the orange symbol, but the flow down south was not as abundant relative to the north. And so that really set us up for this project. It's a collaborative project. Like I said, it's funded by the NSF. And we aim to understand how subsurface fluid flow patterns are coupled to changes in crustal permeability. The PI for the project is Dan Fernari at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the co-PIs are myself, Ross Parnell-Turner at Scripps, and Thibaut Barrière at the CNRS in Paris. And together, our team really was working as from our lenses as geologists, fluid chemists, and geophysicists to understand the system. One of the first tasks of our project was the generation of a great map. And so we produced a 1-meter resolution bathymetric map using the autonomous vehicle Sentry. Sentry is part of the National Deep Submergence Facility, which is a US federally funded center that operates, maintains, and coordinates the use of several vital deep ocean vehicles. That includes AUV Sentry, as well as HOV Alvin and ROV Jason. What you can see in this figure is a visualization of our mapping efforts starting in 2018 on the far left, where we centered our map on the primary focus of the last eruption. And then if you move right, you can see how we've since expanded that map to about 4 kilometers on either side of the ridge crest and all the way north to the Clipperton Transform Fault. All of these maps are work produced by Dr. Jian-Nai Wu, who has used those data as a major part of his PhD thesis that he completed at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and he was a member of Ross Parnell Turner's group. Our map up to 2021 is already publicly available, and that's available to support all of you who work at this mid-ocean ridge crest, and you can find the data in the publication that I'm showing here. This base map also does a great job laying the groundwork for quantifying the effect of eruptions on the seafloor occurring now and in the future. So next, I'd like to describe our approach to the forecast. How does one forecast a deep sea eruption? And so just like at the surface, where you have fresh water that boils at 100 degrees, there are also temperature limits on seawater in the deep sea. That limit of temperature is defined by pressure. And so in the ocean, pressure is directly translated to depth. And so the deeper you are, the higher temperatures the fluids can reach. And this is all set by thermodynamics. If you take a look at this figure, the seafloor depth at 9 North EPR is about 2,500 meters. And that corresponds to 250 times atmospheric pressure, or 250 bar on the figure. And so the black line, designates the two-phase boundary of seawater. You can think of that as analogous to the boiling point. And so at a pressure of 250 bar, that corresponds to a boiling point, or a maximum possible temperature of 390 degrees Celsius. And so in theory, the hottest the fluids can get is 390 degrees Celsius. And so if we project to that temperature, then we can predict the next eruption. Next question is, how do we make these measurements? And so in order to make continuous measurements on the seafloor, because it's a remote location, we have to have instrumentation that we can deploy and leave in place. And so that's where expertise from Dan Fernari really shines in this project. Dan has worked with engineers at Woods Hole and elsewhere to develop high temperature vent fluid loggers. These are capable of measuring hydrothermal temperatures up to 450 degrees Celsius with a precision of 1 degree. They also have an internal attitude sensor, which measures the stability of the logger in the vent. They can be deployed for periods of up to 2 years while making measurements every 10 minutes. The loggers also are able to record an internal temperature in their pressure housing, and that serves as a check on tidal periodicities, which can also change temperature, as well as any proximal warm water or vents in the area that could impact the electronics. And so we've been continuously deploying these loggers at deep sea black smokers since the early 1990s. And I'll show you those data on the next slide. So here are examples of our temperature logger data collected at one of the primary vents. This is at Bio9 vent, which was, as you'll recall, was one of the ones that's centered over the volcanic center. And at Bio9, the figure shown here displays over 700,000 discrete temperature measurements that have been made at this vent since 1991. What our project did is to select the maximum temperatures at any given time as most representative of the source hydrothermal fluid chemistry. And this work is led by Thibaut Barrière in France. Thibaut is a geophysical modeler, so he's been working with the temperature data to create these models. He selects the maximum temperatures in order to remove any kind of short-term variability like mixing from cold seawater. And then Thibaut performed a statistical model to assess the trend lines of these temperature changes. Those model lines are shown in the blue and orange lines in this figure. And so to sum it up, the temperature trends post-eruption show declines in temperature, and those are shown with the blue lines. Leading up to eruptions, the temperatures increase. And so previously, in the data that you can see between about 1993 to 2004, during that previous eruption, when you extend that line to the theoretical maximum temperature of water, that happened to be the timing of our previous eruption. And so Thibault applied that same thinking to our latest temperature trends. And so his publication with these data is currently in review. It was actually submitted just before we heard about the eruption, and his model forecasts an eruption in 2025 with an error estimate of plus or minus 2 years. And Thibault interprets these changing temperature trends as reflecting changes in permeability in the seafloor. This is a derived interpretation of those data. We can't measure permeability directly, but rather Thibault takes the temperature data and then derives permeability. And so I'm going to summarize this very quickly with 2 take-home points. In the post-eruption phase, denoted by the blue lines, permeability in the subsurface is increasing. And so you can think of all the conduits as getting sealed off by mineralization. And in the post-eruption phase, permeability is increasing, and in the pre-eruption, permeability decreases. And so I'd be happy to talk about that more later on, but that was Thibault's interpretation of what was going on within the volcano. The temperature loggers also allow us to observe what we think are subsea floor eruptive events. And so I'm going to highlight one such example here. On this screen, you can see temperature logger data at several vents, including BioVent, Bio9 vent in the blue, M vent, and P. Each line denotes a different record from a different logger. All of them show a contemporaneous increase in temperature, which is up to about 5 degrees Celsius at one certain time point. In this case, it was in November 2020. And so our team interprets that as likely reflecting a diking event, which was a volcanic injection at depth that never surfaced. And so leading up to the seafloor eruption that we saw last week, we were observing evidence for subsea floor volcanism through diking. What I'll take you through next is my part of the project, which is whether or not the actual origin conditions of fluids also shift in response to permeability changes and diking across eruptive cycles. All right, so just to recap, we're able to measure exit temperature directly, just as I just described, and that is done through in situ measurements through the loggers that I just showed you. We have another way to constrain temperature, and you can think of that as being the origin temperature and origin pressure of the fluid. How hot and how deep did the fluid cell circulate into the crust before it ascended? This is not something we can measure directly because these sites are very resistant to seafloor drilling and other techniques for direct observation. However, we do have geochemistry. And so as a geochemist, I've been collecting data for almost 20 years now on the 9 North system and applying a tool called a geothermometer. This particular geothermometer is based on the dissolved ratio of 2 of the most abundant transition metals in the fluid, iron, which is abbreviated Fe, and manganese, Mn. And the ratio provides additional insight on fluid temperature. The conceptual basis for that chemical geothermometer is rooted in hydrothermal experiments. And so in the schematic in the middle, you can see a hydrothermal experimental setup that we call a gold bag. The researcher encloses minerals in a liquid solution, like salt water, in a flexible 24-karat gold bag. That bag is enclosed in a steel pressure containment vessel, and then it's taken up to mimic hydrothermal conditions at very high pressure and very high temperature. What Pester and al. Were able to observe is that iron and manganese respond quite differently to elevated pressure and temperature. And their ratio can be used in an empirical manner to predict the temperature of equilibration of the fluid. So what this means is that when we collect natural vent fluids we can then use their iron to manganese ratio to infer the temperature at which the fluid equilibrated, which corresponds to its hottest temperature in the subsurface. I'll describe briefly how we do that. And so let me see if my video plays. Oh, it's just a still, that's okay. So like I said, the two most abundant transition metals in hydrothermal fluids are iron and manganese. We do this work through the collection of trace metal clean samplers in either one of two types of hydrothermal fluid sampler. We either use a titanium syringe style, what's called a Majors sampler, and that's what's pictured at the top right, or we can use titanium isobaric gas tight samplers. Either way, they can collect trace metal clean samples. So we do a careful sampler cleaning protocol between samples. The data that I'm showing here are an example of data from work by Connor Downing, who was a master's student of mine when the project first started. Connor did a really beautiful job plotting up his hydrothermal data. Along the x-axis, you can see magnesium, and along the y-axis, you see the transition metal of interest. Vent fluids chemists tend to plot things versus magnesium because seawater is very magnesium rich, as you can see in the black square, whereas vent fluids have been shown through theory and experiment and observation to be very poor in magnesium, effectively zero. And so by plotting each fluid composition, which are shown in the colored symbols, by plotting its measured magnesium versus its measured analyte of interest, and projecting that line to zero magnesium, you can derive what the source or end member fluid composition was. And so we've gone through all of our data and calculated these source compositions for all of the data that we have available since 1991. We've then applied the geothermometer and calculated an origin temperature for the fluids. So here are some of those results summarized. I'll take you through the main points. Immediately post-eruption, after the 1991 or 1992 eruption, or after 2005, 2006, the venting fluids were circulating at very shallow depths in the crust, and they were only reaching temperatures of about 390. You'll recall that's their theoretical maximum temperature at the seafloor. So effectively, they're phase separating or boiling right at the seafloor immediately post-eruption. Between eruptions, some of the vents, like Bio9 and P, which are in pink and red, those vents show a gradual warming. So you can see, for example, Bio9 and P in 1993 start to warm up in the subsurface. Then they plateau at temperatures around 410 to 420, leading up to the eruption in 2005, 2006. Over the last several years, the dynamics have been a little different, but they've been forming at similar temperatures. What we can next do using geochemistry is use other pressure and temperature sensitive elements, including silica, to calculate what pressure they would have originated at. And so those origin pressures are going to be contextualized by the presence of an axial magma lens. That's what I've shown here in the red bar in the bottom of this figure. That's been imaged at about 1.45 kilometers below seafloor in a seismic study by Milena Marjanovic. And so you'll also see a line on here that denotes the transition between layer 2A and 2B. Those are different layers of the oceanic crust. And so the seafloor depth here is about 2,500 meters, as I've mentioned earlier. What I'll overlay next are the origin pressures that we've calculated from fluid geothermobarometry. So here they are. To summarize these, what we observe is immediately post-eruption, vent fluids circulate at very shallow depths, just within the first upper 100 to 200 meters below the seafloor. That may be what's happening right now. Over time, fluid circulation cells gradually deepen to depths about 400 to 800 meters below the seafloor. Or you could think of that from the bottom up, they're about 500 meters above the magma lens. And so where we stood up until last week is we have warming trends that forecast an eruption for 2025. And then for the first time in 20 years, the 950 segment of EPR has erupted. And so here's the press release. This was published last Friday by the New York Times. And so it's a beautiful press release. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend it. One of the really stunning things about the press release is the author shares a picture of what the ecosystem looked like on Monday, followed by the same area where they dove on Tuesday. And so here you can see the brand new lava flows that have totally covered up this thriving ecosystem. And that was a very clear indication that there was an active undersea volcanic eruption taking place. And so this work was led by another NSF-funded project. And that project is led by Andrew Wozniak at University of Delaware, as well as his co-PIs, Suni Shah-Walter and George Luther, also at University of Delaware, Sasha Wagner at RPI, and Mustafa Yücel, who's an international collaborator from Turkey. And their project is working on understanding whether vents are a source for aromatic carbon in the deep ocean. And they aim to understand how those aromatic carbon pools could control the sequestration of carbon, both over short and geologic timescales. And so they were funded separately by the NSF, and they were diving at that site with Alvin just last week when they made this exciting discovery. We're so glad they were there, and they've been doing an awesome job collecting shipboard data, and they'll be getting into port quite soon. And so I would be remiss if I didn't also describe all of the other people involved. This effort is the product of the work of dozens of additional scientists. Between these two teams, our projects have advanced the careers of over 56 scientists, and I've just showed them here in a schematic. And I'll just point out that the large number of graduate students. There's at least 25 graduate students between just these two projects alone. And that really underscores the direct societal value of federal science support. Beyond the scientists, the footprint of the project is even larger. We are also really well equipped to study this system moving forward. And so in the next slide, I'm going to share with you our rich time series of existing data. And so this ranges from physicochemical in situ measurements. We have currently deployed 9 deep sea temperature loggers that are still there to the best of our knowledge. We also had deployed 4 bottom tilt current meters that are still out there as well. We've been regularly collecting hydrothermal fluids with gas-tight samplers. We've been also regularly collecting conductivity, temperature, depth data and sensor data. We've been collecting 4K or higher resolution imagery. We have our 1 meter resolution bathymetric map. We've also been collecting seawater environmental DNA sample and microbial samples. We have developed an animal DNA reference database, and recently we recovered some community monitoring arrays from 2 vent sites. These are basically, you could think of them as large, well, at an animal scale, a condo-like structure for animals to move into. And so we were able to collect some of these samples a couple years ago now. And so we have a very good sense of the community composition pre-eruption. And so to sum it up, we are really uniquely positioned to observe and understand the changes and impacts that develop during the eruption and its aftermath. And so as far as the next steps go, Ross and I and many others in our community are very interested in trying to put together a rapid response expedition. We would love for that to be in about mid-June. And we're coordinating an international network of partners, including scientists in Central America, to really mount this very rapid scientific response. We want to document the time-sensitive part of this once-in-a-generation mid-ocean ridge eruption. And so we're seeking partnerships with organizations that can support this effort. This slide describes some of our scientific objectives for this rapid response cruise. Most urgently, we would like to deploy an array of 19 available ocean bottom seismographs that are available at Scripps. These would be able to record the seismic aftermath of the eruption, as well as any ongoing eruptive events that are still taking place. We can also document ecosystem changes using high-resolution imagery. using vehicle ROV cameras as well as 4K meso cameras that are available at Hui. We aim to recover those 9 temperature loggers that may have survived and recorded the eruption, as well as redeploy new ones with fresh batteries. We would also conduct biogeochemical and biodiversity sampling at the eruption site. And for this work, we have gas-tight fluid samplers and in situ seawater filtration systems for environmental DNA and microbes. These are all available through Lehigh. The support that we need are funds for roughly 3 weeks ship time in the Eastern Equatorial Pacific. The nearest ports are San Diego. That's also where the ocean bottom seismographs are located, as well as Mazatlan and Costa Rica. We also are seeking funds for a 2,500 meter capable ROV. We're open to all ideas for assets and for funding support. And so what I'll do next is acknowledge our funders and leave some time for questions. So this work was funded through the National Science Foundation, grants to Lehigh, to Hui, and to Scripps. I also want to acknowledge the pioneering work of Karen Von Dam and her laboratory group. They generated the legacy data set that starts back in 1991 and ran up through 2007. I also acknowledge Jeff Seawald, who provides some data from 2014, and the US NSF Ridge 2000 program, which generated those data up until 2007. I also acknowledge the captain and crew of the research vessel Atlantis and Ravel, and the AUV Century DSV Alvin and ROV Jason 2 teams, as well as the institutions that host us. You can see my contact info at the bottom. And I thank you again, InterRidge, for hosting me today. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Jill. That was excellent. So we have plenty of time for questions. If you'd like to ask Jill a question, please feel free to raise your hand using the reaction through Zoom, and I'll let Jill call upon people. Alternatively, you can type questions into the chat, and we will read them out, and Jill can respond to them. So I'll leave it to you, Jill, to call on people as they raise their hands.
Great, thanks. Oof, there's a lot of people here. Maybe also go to the chat. There we go.
And don't all dive in at once.
Cheryl, what's your question?
Hey, Jill. Great talk.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you.
Just wondering if you've talked to Bill Chadwick about this lovely prediction model and applied it to axial volcano, because I know he would love to be so accurate with the prediction of a volcanic eruption.
Yeah, we haven't discussed it directly with Bill yet. I believe he commented on the New York Times piece, so I know he's aware of it. We'd love to talk more and have more people take this approach. I know that we've also have there's a lot of activity going on at axial volcano, as Cheryl mentioned, and also at the Endeavor section of the ridge. So it'd be great to get more loggers deployed. Yeah. I have a question from Satish. You're muted.
Yes, it's a very, very nice talk and a very exciting story you are developing. My first question is the same as previous question. Do you try to correlate what's happening at axial with this location? That's first in terms of thermal structure and the temperature. The second question is why we have eruption only around 950, not elsewhere along EPR. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Those are excellent questions. I see no reason the same approach that we've taken would not work at a place like axial. The main thing would be to deploy temperature loggers in the hottest fluids, right? Using the meso temperature loggers, because it's that the resolution that we get from in situ direct measurements for such a long time interval is really critical for having the statistical power to make the forecast. And so I can make, on my own water samplers, we take point source measurements of temperature, but having that temperature record every 10 minutes and having that data density is really vital. I think there is opportunity now that we've seen that it worked. We can instrument other systems, and the temperature loggers are great because they're very robust. They're relatively straightforward to deploy, and they produce excellent data that's very reliable. And so it's a relatively low cost way to keep an eye on the seafloor, especially in remote places where humans are not always immediately present. Your other question was, why did it erupt at 950 and not elsewhere on the EPR? Well, I could, that's an excellent question. Why is 950 have such a high magmatism rate compared to elsewhere in the immediate, vicinity of, between Siquirres and Clipperton? Well, really, to get at that question, we've been increasing our coverage with the high resolution bathymetric map. That's really the first, most fundamental observation that we must make in order to understand change in the seafloor, particularly with this type of volcanism. So the thickness of the new lava flows, at least in the last eruption, were about on the order of 1 meter thick. And so in order to observe a 1 meter thick flow, you really need the resolution from a mapping autonomous underwater vehicle like Sentry. And so that's why we've been doing that mapping, so that we can then resurvey parts of the ridge crest to really identify what can be somewhat subtle and easily missed in a shipboard multi-beam system. So to some extent, there may be more eruptions than we're aware of, but we don't really have the mapping data to pick them out, right? And so more high resolution mapping will really advance our understanding of eruption frequency. There may be other reasons why 950 has this regularly occurring volcanism, but I'd rather not speculate on that. I have some ideas, but I won't speculate. I think now that it's erupted 3 times, there's actually a lot of opportunity to look into that, since we now see that those first 2 eruptions indeed were setting up this cycle. Let's see. I think, Milena, did you have a question? No, okay. I thought I saw one more question, but.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Jill.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Can
you see those?
Yeah, I see those.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Steve asks, have you applied other stable isotopic methods to fluids for determining PT conditions below the seafloor, and how do they agree with iron to manganese? Great question. I haven't used stable isotopes per se. We've looked at some stable isotopes like strontium stable isotopes that we can use to infer changes to permeability, which is supported by the temperature model, the temperature data and the models that Thibault has generated. But that doesn't really get at temperature. And so if you have a stable isotope system to suggest, put it in the chat. We likely have the fluids. We do use other geothermal barometers to double check the iron to manganese results. So for example, we use silica, we use chlorinity in many cases as 3 different ways to check the geothermal barometry. We can also look at things like the partitioning of some of our minor elements into different fluid phases, such as bromide partitioning. And so all of those are tools that I use in the system. I presented the iron to manganese today, but there's other ways to double check whether everything hangs together. But yeah, if you have suggestions of isotope systems, please put some in the chat. Okay, I'll go next to Jameson Ward. I'm reading your question. Oh yeah, very good question. Let me pull up that slide again. Explain that one. Just give me a moment. Okay. Do you all see my slide? Yeah, okay. So you were wondering, at temperatures of 410 and 420, are the fluids phase separating at supercritical conditions? The short answer to that is because of the thermodynamic properties of water right around the critical point, it's hard to model things right around that critical point. So I usually stay away from that particular temperature. But once you get past the critical point, up to about 10 degrees past, then you can apply the models to indeed infer that the fluids are phase separating at supercritical conditions. So I didn't walk through all these details over here, but it's quite common to see sustained formation of vent fluids at supercritical conditions, particularly at 950 in the years that lead up to an eruption. And for those of you that might not have as much background in this, if the fluid phase separates, it can be categorized as either having undergone subcritical phase separation, if that happens at pressures shallower than the critical point of seawater, or supercritical phase separation, if it phase separates, which you'll recall is somewhat analogous to boiling at temperatures and pressures greater than the critical point. If you look over on the right side, you can see some of the outcomes of this process. And so in both cases, if your starting fluid is seawater, which is represented by this blue circle, under conditions of subcritical phase separation, what actively happens is a liquid vapor bubble forms. And this is characterized by a chlorinity less than the chlorinity of seawater. And it leaves behind another fluid phase called the liquid brine phase. And so it tends to have a chlorinity very close to seawater or a little bit higher. And you could think of this as the saltiness of the water. Chloride is the most dominant anion in the fluid. Alternatively, if the fluid phase separates at greater pressures beyond the critical point, it undergoes supercritical phase separation. In that case, a liquid brine droplet forms with a chlorinity greater than seawater or close to it, leaving behind a liquid vapor phase. And so at a place like 950, what we often see venting is either the liquid vapor phase or the liquid brine or the residual brine that's accumulated over time. And so we infer that many of these fluids are actively undergoing phase separation more or less continuously. That's true certainly for the Bio9 vent, the one that Thibaut produced the model for. So Bio9 has fluctuated. Sometimes it phase separates in subcritical conditions, like in the aftermath of an eruption, when it's very close to the seafloor. And then other times, as the fluids penetrate deeper into the crust, it can phase separate at supercritical conditions. What we see right after eruptions is that they actually shallow and they don't permeate very deeply. And so right now, if I were to guess, I would suggest that Bio9 is probably under subcritical conditions, but that's something we'd have to verify through a rapid response. Great. I'll go to Henry. Yes, Henry.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. A really, really cool talk. Thanks so much. I have a kind of a clarifying question about the permeability relationships prior to eruption. So I think you mentioned that the permeability is decreasing due to mineralization. Is that solely due to mineral buildup from precipitation out of the hydrothermal fluids, or is permeability also decreasing because of pressure from the underlying magma lens exerting a force on the rock and therefore providing some kind of compressive stress that would reduce permeability?
That's a great question, Henry. So you're wondering really what is the cause of the permeability shift, whether it might be all strictly driven by mineralization processes or by some kind of buildup of strain. I mean, the short answer is, I think it's both, is my best interpretation. Over time, we know for sure that minerals accumulate in the fluid flow pathways. New conduits also open up and then they close off through mineral formation. Thibaut has also taken these data further and calculated strain in the crust, but I didn't show those data today. So I know for sure that that conceptually he thinks that strain is playing a big role as well in changing the permeability of the crust. As the magma lens is building pressure, that would increase the strain on the crust that overlies the magma lens. Yeah, really thoughtful
Okay,
question.
thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, let me stop that for a moment. I'll go back over to the chat.
Okay, I'll give people like a couple more seconds for a last minute question. If you'd like to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Otherwise, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on the US InterRidge website. You can see that a link to that website is in the email that you hopefully saw when you signed up for the webinar. So if there are no more questions, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Jill one more time for giving us this excellent update and wonderful talk. So thank you, Jill. And hopefully we'll see many of you next month on June the 4th, when our next speaker is Brendan Smith from Dalhousie University. And once again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you all for your attention.